I can think of several reasons why it is so timely to hear from Ruth at this moment. We're living in a moment where many nations and leaders, including most prominently here in this country, are asserting a narrow national identity above all and erecting quite violently ever higher borders. But I think one thing that strikes me is the way that Ruth's life has encompassed crossing many borders and fostering fellowship. Born to and raised by renowned theologians and teachers, Ruth has lived in Colombia, Argentina, Ecuador, studied here in Chicagoland and Boston, and now splits her time between Costa Rica and Michigan as professor of world Christianity at Western Theological Seminary. At a moment when technologically advanced nations have pushed the climate into collapse that drives our global neighbors from their homes to seek refuge in other lands, Ruth has engaged these events as the context for the church's calling into holistic or integral mission. She has served and led organizations seeking to care for neighbors like Arosha, an international family of Christian environmental organizations. But I think what's equally important and significant for us is the way that she is also engaged in care for neighbors on the ground. She and her husband, James, have helped in the establishment of Casa Dobe, an intentional Christian community in San Jose, Costa Rica, a community that seeks to live in reconciled relationship with the neighboring watershed, the children of the surrounding community, and migrants who are pouring through Central America. EP friend Sylvia Kiesmont was a guest speaker, I believe, earlier this spring. And Amy and I are jazzed that our daughter Sonia is now spending the summer at Casa Dobe, participating in their life as a community. But I believe that one of the things I find most compelling about Ruth's work is her storytelling. I've heard Ruth speak in a number of different contexts over the last couple of decades, including a class in which I was her student. Her stories and storytelling are lively, vivid, and winsome. But don't be fooled. Ruth's stories often turn and make claims on us, and we find ourselves caught up into a radical discipleship that includes our neighbors, our planet, other creatures, and our whole selves. As we seek to have our hope renewed in the midst of a grieving world, we need the gift of imagination that Ruth's perspective invites and that Ruth herself embodies. A gospel imagination that crosses borders, embraces neighbors, and summons us to holistic discipleship. Please join me in welcoming Ruth Padilla DeBorst.
Tardes. Hakuna Matata. No stress, take it easy. The Swahili phrase was turned into a catchy tune in the Lion King movie. No worries till the end of your days. And how can one achieve such a blissful state? The answer is obvious. Consume. Binge on Netflix. Peace by distraction. Values in our current world culture are determined by the market. Everything in our current world is bought and sold. Experiences, thoughts, sex, and yes, even people. And believe it or not, you can also buy hope. Hope in a stick. I actually forgot it in my bag. I need not proceed with my talk, just buy this lip balm. Advertising, be it commercial, political, or social, advertising varnishes and embellishes reality. It makes it more palatable and, of course, more importantly, more sellable. Unbridled consumption serves as a sedative of sorts, numbing us, akuna matataing us. As we come together these days, we join to question that superficial optimism and all that it rests on. We've gathered to nourish deep hope and resilience in the midst of a groaning creation. Well, as I stand before you, I must admit that I feel quite at a loss because the weight of current reality is so heavy. And in total honesty, I feel I don't have a whole lot to say. But I do offer these following reflections on dry bones and green sprouts as tentative fumbling, as trusting it will be God's Spirit, not my words, who stir our imaginations and point us towards the prophetic hope that is embodied in the community of Jesus' way. Before continuing, and as habitual for me and in true Latin American fashion, I have to bring you greetings. Greetings from the communities that send me. Greetings then from the Community of Interdisciplinary Studies, SETI, which seeks to nourish theology from life and for life for faithful gospel witness. And greetings from Casa Adobe, of which I'll share more towards the end of my talk. So we begin with an invitation to strip off the varnish of our consumptive society with all its religious justifications by joining the ancient prophet Ezekiel as he stares reality in the face, not in the least a pretty picture. While Israel is suffering under the imperial fist of Babylon, the Spirit of God leads the prophet Ezekiel into a vision of a valley full of dead bones, not just for a quick peek. Back and forth, the Spirit leads him. No avoidance possible. Ezekiel has to pick his way with care, tiptoeing in order not to crunch down on this tibia here or that femur there. The bones are dry. They've been there for a long time. Birds have picked over them. The sun has scorched them. And according to Israel's law, walking among dead bodies makes a person unclean. And this is worse yet. The priest is forced to make his way through this horrendous mess of unburied and consequently defiled remnants of what once had been women, men, and children. Ezekiel's is no easy task. While the nation is suffering the consequence of its distance from God and God's purposes, its idolatry and injustice, and false prophets are whitewashing reality, declaring peace where there is no peace, Ezekiel must tell the truth. Death must be named. No numb avoidance is possible. The only way out is through. What of our world today? What dry bones need we name? The list is long and very heavy. Intractable wars, thousands upon thousands of innocent lives cut short, their death funded by the taxes of US citizens. Land burning here and flooding there. Millions of people, the least responsible for climate change, forcibly displaced, while the US government dismisses the threats and slashes budgets for alternative energy sources. Species dying out. The weapon and drug industries thriving, while people are being trafficked to foreign gulags and women for the sex trade. Measures designed to guarantee equal opportunity to people who have been deprived of them are being violently and abruptly rolled back. The color of a person's skin is earning them arrest and deportation. Racial profiling is running unchecked. Fellow human beings, many of whom share the Christian faith with us, and far from de-Christianizing the U.S., are de-Americanizing U.S. Christianity, are treated inhumanly. Legislation cemented to shift wealth and protections from the most vulnerable to the richest people of this nation and the world. These are all forms of death, dry bones that the Spirit requires us to see close up. No avoidance possible. The first step towards prophetic hope is the acknowledgement, the naming of all that does not fit with God's will for abundant life for the entire created order. That naming is voiced in the language of lament, passion rather than indifference. And by the way, this is art by Guaja Samin, an Ecuadorian painter. Passion rather than indifference. Instead of numbness, grief, that gut-wrenching, spirit-quelching weight that bears down on us and drains the color out of our surroundings. Mourning that shatters denial. As Walter Brueggemann has repeatedly pointed out, Scripture is full of invitations and examples of what it looks like to name the brokenness. Prophetic lament, in his words, quote, speaks metaphorically but concretely about the real deathliness that hovers over us and gnaws within us, end quote. And again, quote, such weeping is a radical criticism, a fearful dismantling of all that conspires against life, end quote. Tragically, however, all too many self-identified Christians in this nation seem far from willing to acknowledge, let alone lament, the unjust and deadening current state of affairs. 72% of white evangelicals continue supporting a US president who has more than doubled his estimated fortune from $2.3 billion to $5.1 billion in 1 year. Congress unabashedly passes a life-sapping bill that steals from the poor to give to the rich. Like the false prophets of Ezekiel's day, religious leaders like Pastors for Trump whitewash reality. They're convinced that this country has been elected by God for an exceptional destiny. They acritically celebrate the president's pledge to bring back Christianity, and indifferent to the impact of his policies, affirm that he was appointed by God for such a time as this. Brueggemann's description is currently applicable. Quote, empires live by numbness. Empires, in their militarism, expect numbness about the human cost of war. Corporate economies expect blindness to the cost in terms of poverty and exploitation. Governments and societies of domination go to great lengths to keep the numbness intact, end quote. Of course, this is not the first imperial power that has used religion as a means of dominance. The analysis of Scottish theologian John Mackay is worth quoting in length in reference to Spanish imperial expansion in what we know as Latin America. Of course, any parallel with the US today is mere coincidence. In the case of my Spanish ancestors, in John Mackay's words, quote, the Roman Church was nationalized in the country and became fused with the state in such a way that the juridical distinction between church and state disappeared. The throne and the altar, patriotism and religion became identified. As a logical consequence, no minorities nor heretics could be tolerated within the borders of the state, end quote. Naturally, within this framework, for their conquest of the indigenous people, also my ancestors, continues Mackay, quote, the sword and the cross entered into partnership. It was this partnership, formed in the name of evangelism, in which the sword opened the way for the cross, and the cross sanctified the work of the sword, that constituted the originality of Spanish Christianity, end quote. In all of this, profit was the main motor. And Mackay continues, quote, the royal coffers of Spain brimmed over with gold, and that became her ruin. She has emerged from her cavern to conquer and Catholicize the New World. She conquered it, and in its Catholicization, de-Christianized itself. This took place because, quote, last one, while their religious message was entirely devoid of ethical content and their own lives of Christian attractiveness and consistency, the conquistadores had a passion for the external rites of Catholicism. Echoes here of God's challenge through the prophets, who call out numbing religious practices and worship liturgies devoid of ethical teeth. Not at all surprising in that scenario is the position of the Cuman cacique Hatuey, who asked the evangelizing Spaniards, are there other Christians in heaven? Why, yes, of course, was the natural reply. Well, I do not want to go to any place where I shall have any chance of meeting them. One cannot but wonder about missionary ventures emanating from the current empire. But again, any connection with the current US power at home and abroad is a mere coincidence. When supposedly Christian leaders today judge compassion and care for others as dangerous evils to be avoided and demonize empathy not only as the fundamental weakness of Western civilization, but as toxic and downright sinful, faithful prophets cannot but call out loud and clear, no, it is not so. Within God's economy, compassion and empathy are virtues. They open our eyes, they open our hearts to the pain of others, and in so doing, make us more fully human, more like Christ who suffers for the world. Brueggemann explains, Jesus penetrates the numbness with his compassion, and with his compassion takes the first step by making visible the odd abnormality that had become business as usual. Thus, compassion might be seen simply as generous goodwill, is in fact criticism of the system, forces and ideologies that produce the hurt. Jesus enters into the hurt and finally comes to embody it, end quote. Built into prophetic lament is a rotund no, a compassionate and adamant refusal to accept unjust reality as an intractable given. Says Brazilian Ruben Alves, and I quote, shame on those who name as sane the absurdity of the world. Shame on the false prophets of Ezekiel's and our day. Shame on us when we settle for less than God's will for God's world. Shame on us when Christian prayers simply seek a divine stamp of approval for the life-sapping policies and actions constructed by the powerful of the day. Dry bones must be named as such and lamented. At the same time, hard as it may seem to believe it, that is not the end of the story. There is good news. Not superficial Hakuna Matata news, but a deeper, more substantive reality. In the first place, our lament has a compassionate interlocutor. Taken by the Spirit to the desert, Ezekiel engaged in conversation with God. Son of man, asked God, can these bones live? Sovereign Lord, you alone know. And God responds with the promise of new life. God is God enough and close enough to receive our pained questioning. We can voice our dissatisfaction openly in words like these written by Nicholas Walterstorff. Quote, how is faith to endure, O God, when you allow all this scraping and tearing on us? You have allowed rivers of blood to flow, mountains of suffering to pile up, sobs to become humanity's song, all without lifting a finger that we could see. You have allowed bonds of love beyond number to be painfully snapped. If you have not abandoned us, explain yourself. We strain to hear, but instead of hearing an answer, we catch sight of God himself, scraped and torn. Through our tears, we see the tears of God. This is the wonder of the gospel. The biblical story portrays God as one who does not remain at a distance above and beyond creation, human and non-human. God not only hears, God not only sees, God in God's self suffers. God personally experiences the pain of a suffering creation. Through the prophet Isaiah, God reminded the exiled Israelites that God takes on the pain of humanity and bears their suffering as a suffering servant. You'll remember Isaiah 53. Supremely in Jesus Christ, God owned the limitations of the human condition and exposed God's self to the injustices of zealous religious leaders and oppressive imperial powers, all the way to criminal execution. Worse yet, on the cross, Jesus suffered the utterly painful separation from his Father. Yes, in our lament, we strain to hear, and instead of hearing an answer, we catch sight of God himself, scraped and torn. Through our tears, we see the tears of God. At the same time, and this is the turning point, that divine body, broken for the sake of the world, did not ever become dry bones. Death was not, is not victorious over love. Having descended into the depths of darkness, Jesus rose again and rules in love over the entire cosmos. Ezekiel's vision was an anticipation of that triumph. Then God said, this is Ezekiel, prophesy to those bones and say to them, dry bones, hear the word of the Lord. This is what the sovereign Lord says to these bones. I will make breath enter you, and you will come to life. I will attach tendons to you and make flesh come upon you and cover you with skin. I will put breath in you, and you will come to life. Then you will know that I am the Lord. The prophet did as he was told, and he watched in awe as all the bones came together, took on flesh and skin, and then received the breath of life, and finally stood together as a vast multitude. This was not a selective, individual recovery, but instead a communal affair. The restored bodies became a community. God then told the prophet to reassure the oppressed exiles whose hope had been entirely sapped. My people, I am going to open your graves and bring you up from them. I will bring you back to the land of Israel. Then you, my people, will know that I am the Lord. When I open your graves and bring you up from them, I will put my spirit in you, and you will live, and I will settle you in your own land. The promise was radical. Life after death, home after exile, community after dispersion, the gift of God's Spirit after estrangement. Hope would be rekindled for those open to receiving it, from dry bones to green sprouts. Says Ruben Alves, Brazilian theologian, quote, "For the Bible, believing in God means the same as believing that, in spite of our realistic affirmation of reality, something new and unexpected will suddenly arrive. This changes completely the possibilities of human life and of fullness." Gospel hope is not the shallow Hakuna Matata variety. It is rooted in God's repeated and loving eruption into history and rests on the final rule of the slaughtered but standing lamb. I love the way Ruben Alves puts it. At the height of an oppressive military dictatorship in Brazil, he published Hijos de Mañana, Tomorrow's Children. Allow me to share his poetic portrayal, which parses out what gospel hope looks like. What is hope, he asks? It is a presentiment that imagination is more real than reality, less real than it looks. It is a hunch that the overwhelming brutality of facts that oppress and repress is not the last word. It is a suspicion that reality is more complex than realism wants us to believe, and that the frontiers of the possible are not determined by the limits of the actual, and that in a miraculous and unexpected way, life is preparing the creative events which will open the way to freedom and resurrection. The two, suffering and hope, live from each other. Suffering without hope produces resentment and despair. Hope without suffering creates illusions, naivete, and drunkenness. Let us plant dates, even though those who plant them will never eat them. We must live by the love of what we will never see. This is the secret discipline. It's a refusal to let the creative act be dissolved in immediate sense experience, and a stubborn commitment to the future of our grandchildren. Such disciplined love is what has given prophets, revolutionaries, and saints the courage to die for the future they envisaged. They make their own bodies the seed of their highest hope. There is much to process in this poetic rendition, and we can share the slide for future reference. Frontiers of the possible are not determined by the limits of the actual. Frontiers of the possible are not determined by the limits of the actual. Suffering and hope live from each other. We must live by the love of what we will never see, our own bodies as seeds of our highest hope. So beyond lofty dreams, what does embodied hope look like? I propose that it looks like alternative communities practicing resurrection, singing to a tune other than the dominant one. It looks like gardening and tree planting in urban deserts. It looks like breaking cycles of childhood abandonment through community-based education. It looks like radical hospitality of vulnerable migrants and rejected refugees. It looks like practices and rhythms that nurture a shared imagination. It looks like common purses and shared property. It looks like affirming the place of those who might be dismissed. It looks like new wineskin ecclesial experiments. It looks like restoring our relationship with the rest of creation. It looks like bringing the broader community together to address common challenges. So beyond shallow Hakuna Matata optimism, coupled with numbing avoidance, is hope possible on this side of history? Can we pick our way around the dry bones without withering inside in the process? Truly, no turn of phrase in the most articulate talk can bridge from despairing lament to bright hope. No human action will turn dry bones into nourishing green sprouts. But if we have ears to hear and eyes to see, like Ezekiel, we can be witnesses of God's life-giving intervention. And as the freshly assembled community of the King, we can become green sprouts, breaking our way through the cement of an unjust world order by the power of God's life-giving Spirit. May it be so.